All right, Dr. Enrique Aleman Jr., thank you very much for coming on to TheBoxingBar.com and welcome, sir.
It's good to be with you.
And first of all, Doctor, I'm very excited that you came on, first of all, and I appreciate your time. Now, I haven't really explained exactly why I brought you on or why I asked you to come on. But just to let you know a little background, last year, I'm in my mid 40s. I'm a Mexican American from California, lived here all my life. And last year, for the first time, I enrolled in a few college online classes, believe it or not. And
Mm.
one of the courses I took was Chicano Studies. And during one of our homework assignments, we actually had to watch Stolen Education, a film by you and Rudy Luna. And it was released in 2013. And I guess you, better than anybody, can explain a little bit about that particular movie and what the objective was. So, if you could go ahead and do so for the listeners.
For sure. Well, that's a great intro right there. I didn't know that you had watched it. So thanks again for having me on, and for being interested in the film. So I'll already take you back to 2002. I was in my doctoral program. I'm originally from South Texas, and so I'm a fifth generation Tejano. And I was fortunate enough to go to college and get my master's degree. And then in about 2000, the year 2000, I started my doctoral program at the University of Texas in Austin. And my mother had been struggling with breast cancer for really since the late 90s. She was pretty young. She was in her 40s when she got it the first time. And around 2002, it came back pretty hard, the second round of it. And again, I was in the middle of my doctoral program when my dad called me and told me that she wasn't doing well. He was taking her to the hospital, that I needed to get back home, and went down and was fortunate to be with her for a couple of days, and she passed away. And so I was right in the middle of my doctoral program where, you know, you go through a lot of emotions when you're with your mom and she passes away. Soon after we buried her in her hometown, I was watching a film about the American GI Forum, which is a civil rights group that Mexican American veterans founded right after World War II. So the film was about the American GI Forum, and they talked about this little town called Driscoll, which is a small South Texas town that my mother grew up in, and that we had literally just buried her at that little town. And so I freaked out when I saw that film, and we had just buried her, and they talked about this small town of Driscoll, and I realized that that's where this case that they were talking about in this documentary was a case that my mother was involved with. The case was from 1956, and it was right after Brown versus Board of Education, when the Supreme Court said you can't segregate Black students and white students, and you have to integrate. 2 years after that, districts were still segregated in South Texas, but it was not only black and white, it was black, white, and brown. And so when districts were forced to integrate, they did that, but they started to segregate within the school. And one way they did it with Mexican Americans was to do it by language. So long story short, my mother was part of a court case when she was in elementary school because the district she was in, Driscoll Consolidated School District, which is a small little town, they were putting Mexican American children into 3 levels of first grade. And the reason they said they did that is because none of these kids know how to speak English. Even though all the kids were bilingual, all the kids were US born, they were Mexican Americans. Most of the kids, their dads had just gotten home from World War II and fighting against the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians and the World War II. They came back and started having the baby boom generation. And even after all that, they started segregating their kids. So again, I found out about this case after my mom had died, and I found out that she was part of the case. The district was saying, they're segregating these kids because none of them know how to speak English. The lawyers sued. The families hired the lawyers, and then they sued. And they said, let's put the kids on the witness stand to show that they can speak English. So they picked 8 kids, and I found out later that my mother was the first kid that they picked to testify in federal court that she could speak English. So this kind of blew my mind, and it pissed me off. It blew my mind. I had a lot of questions about why she never told me about it. I was literally in an educational policy doctoral program, and I had never heard about the case. And so at that point, I decided I'm going to go try to find out as much about that case as I can. I'm going to go see if anybody's still alive from that time period, even though my mother is gone now. I want to hear about that case. And so that's what the documentary is about. It's finding out my own family history. It's finding out Chicano history. It's finding out Texas history. And, it really asks the question about, why aren't these histories taught in our schools? Why aren't our children learning about their own histories in our schools? Because a lot of what they were dealing with in 1956 and 57 related to language, related to unequal schools, related to kids being punished for being who they are, is still happening today in our schools. So that's what the film's about. I'm sorry, I'm kind of long-winded, but in general, that's, it was my journey to find out about that case and to ask the question about why my mother never told me about it, and what we can learn about that time period of our history.
Fast forward a little bit to when you were about 10 years old. In the movie, you explained when you were 10 years old is when you saw a picture of her, I believe as a prom queen. And she was she told you she was almost 21 when she graduated from school. And that's pretty much how you found out. Were you still living in Driscoll at that time when you were 10, when you found all this out?
So it's kind of different. I mean, where I grew up is a place called Kingsville. At that time, it was about 25,000 people in the town. Driscoll is about 10 minutes north of that. It's even smaller. It's like 2,000 people. I'm sorry, 300 people, 300 to 500 people. It's rural South Texas. We're about 2 hours south of San Antonio, so closer to the border. And so I wasn't living in Driscoll at the time. You're referring to a part of the film where, even though I found out most of this case, after my mom had died, there is this one time where you're right. I was looking through her yearbook. I must have been around 10 years old, 10 or 11 years old when, her picture's right in the front of the yearbook. I mean, I still have it. She was the first Chicana homecoming queen of her high school. And so I remember asking her about that time period, and she mentioned, I didn't graduate until I was almost 21 years old. She was born in 1946 and she graduated in 1967. So if you do the math, she was in December. So she was 20 and a half years old when she graduated. And that was really the only time that she even mentioned it. So like I said, when I was watching that documentary about the American GI Forum, when I was already older and we had just buried her, I immediately had that flashback. I'm like, man, that must have been the case that she talked to me one time about. And so, yeah, I think a lot of our families, and I give credit to African-American communities and African-American families. I mean, they talk a lot more about their experiences with their young children. It becomes part of their upbringing. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned more and more as I've showed the film and done the film, is we don't really talk about these kinds of experiences in our own households. And my mom was one of them. I think my mom was very proud and she wanted us to move forward, and, she wasn't a negative person. But really these stories and these histories of our own families and our own communities are really, really important for our young people to understand that this is part of the American experience too. And so I think this case is just another one of those examples.
You talked to a lot of the people that were around or that testified in that case, a lot of the children that are now, of course, older. Your mom, obviously, she wasn't around to talk to you about it. Did you find out, is there a certain reason why they try to bury this part of history? You think that these children, is it just because they're trying to get over it type of thing? Or is it, because they were told to keep secret about it? What was it what do you think was the main reason why they're keeping secret? Is it a personal thing, or were they kind of told to or taught to kind of forget about it?
That's a good question. I get that question a lot from people who watch the film. Like, why didn't your mom tell you? Like, why do you think the people from that time period didn't really talk about it? And I think it's a combination, man. I mean, I think a lot of our gente, we're used to just working. Let's keep moving forward. We can't sit here and talk about the bad times. We've got to keep moving forward and just work and provide for the family. I think that's definitely one aspect of it. I think another aspect is it was a very, very difficult time for people. It was very traumatic in a lot of ways. And so I talk about it, I show it in the film where people were spanked for speaking Spanish. People were spanked and punished with a paddle, for being who they were. And so I think for a lot of people from that generation, they said, you know what, I don't want my kids to struggle with that. So we're going to really focus on, making sure they know how to speak English as a first language, and so I think for a lot of folks, they were doing the best that they could, and they were trying to move forward. But the trauma is real. I think the trauma is real. I think that pain is real. You mentioned that I interviewed quite a few people for the film, and most everybody, when I talked to them from that time period, if I asked them, did you go, what was your high school experience like? Most of them did not have good experiences. In fact, none of them went back to their high school reunions. They didn't have like these happy, jolly memories of, going to dances and doing stuff like that. I mean, I think it was a struggle for people. So I think in their minds, a lot of that generation just moved forward, and they wanted to focus on positive things for their kids. And so I think I don't blame my mom for not telling me. I mean, I don't think that she was a bad person. I just think that she was trying to do the right thing by me and my brothers and my sister, and wanting to focus on the positive. And I always tell that generation is like, you know what? Our kids need to know that. It actually would have helped me to know that part of our history. And so that's part of the reason I wanted to do the documentary, and part of the research that I do now as a professor is our young people now, they need to know that. They need to know these are the strong people you come from. And so that's part of the learning that I've done in just doing the film.
And also, in the film, you speak to a lot of people in a few different areas there in Texas. And I believe there was a couple I remember you interviewed. They had Esparza, I believe was their last name, that they had on their jacket. You talk about moving forward, but at the same time, it doesn't seem like a lot of people move forward. They were talking about actual racism still going on, in those areas. From you driving around and kind of checking out those areas and speaking to the Latinos, and also speaking to the white people that you interviewed on your video there, did you still feel a lot of the racism still kind of there, just being around those areas?
Oh yeah. Again, I'm in Texas, man. Just turn on the turn on the TV. Turn on the TV.
Yeah, I hear about it all the time.
I think now, and I'm proud Tejano. I have several generations, obviously, of proud Tejanos. And, I'm not going anywhere anymore. Like I lived away from home for a few years, and I worked at the University of Utah, was gone for, lived in New York, lived in Washington, D.C. But I'm from here, man. And, they're not going to run me off. But I think that just going back to that small town, and again, I have 3 generations of my people buried in that town, my mother included. So when I walked back in there, it was very, very emotional for me to walk back. I didn't grow up in that town. Again, it's close to where I grew up, but it's a small little town, and people are still very racist. I mean, they'll be right up front about it. So yeah, I think that's something, and I do critical race theory work. I don't know if you've been following the news, a lot of the push about getting rid of critical race theory and that sort of thing. Part of what we do as critical race theorists is we center issues related to racism. We're trying to understand why racism exists, and not only for Black communities, but for Mexican American, Chicano, Latino communities. So it's still very much a part of the experience in the U.S. Everything from here in South Texas, we have detention centers. We have where we're separating kids, like literally 20 minutes outside. I live in San Antonio now. 20 minutes outside of San Antonio, there's a family, separation site. I mean, we're literally separating kids right now from their families. We have a very strong border patrol presence here. So when you go down to South Texas, oh yeah, you feel it. You feel it. People don't want to talk about it, both Latino and white. And so my point is, we need to talk about it. We need to not deny that this is part of what we are as a country. We're good, but we're also, this is a very much a part of what we're about. And in order for us to solve those problems, you have to talk about it. You have to struggle with it. And for our kids who are living through it, we have to help them live through that. Otherwise, you can't navigate systems without understanding this is where we come from. And so I think that's the other thing that the film has tried to do, is to say, even though this was the past, 1956, 57, like you said, this is also the present. We're living through this right now. And I think people in Texas are worried. Chicanos and Latinos make up the majority of the public school system. We just are about to be the majority of the whole state of Texas, everybody included. They're worried. And that's one of the reasons they're going to put up a fight about it, And so we can't advocate for ourselves unless we know who we are. there's no way for us to advocate for our communities if we don't know where we come from. And so we have to talk about this type of history.
I agree 100%. And I remember you interviewed also one of the ladies there. I believe she didn't want to come on the video because she said I think her house was a mess or something like that. But I remember she was talking about how she didn't finish school, and she went on and she started working odd little jobs to make whatever money, but without education, she didn't get far. And you kind of start thinking right when she's talking and saying all this stuff, you kind of start understanding that the system was doing everything to break these kids' confidence and will.
Exactly.
And they kind of, they kind of made it happen, and they got the job done, for a lot of people. I mean, you just mentioned a few of them, but I mean, there was a lot more that happened in other areas and near there. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's exactly what they were trying to do, is have people not be educated, hopefully break their will, and hopefully they could stop going to school, not get educated, and start working these, meaningless jobs?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, both of my mom and dad, they come from migrant farm working communities, like a lot of our gente, right?
Mm-hmm.
In South Texas and in California too.
Okay.
I mean, we come from farm working, people who work hard, people who are good people. The economic systems benefit from having us as workers. And so one of the first ways you do that is you shut down any opportunities of equal opportunity in schools. And one of the ways you do that is you don't let them be proud of or use their language. You strip their language away. You strip language, you strip history, you strip any kind of culture, and it's what they call subtractive schooling. Whenever you subtract about parts of who you are, and you set up a system to do that, well, very few people who that can get through that. So, I think that's what happened, and it's happened all across the Southwest. And like I said, it's happened in Texas and in California, all around. And it continues to happen. It happens, when I go into my classroom at a university and the majority in San Antonio, and the majority doesn't look like this community. I mean, that's not by accident. It's not that we're not smart. It's not that we don't have talented people. It's that systems have been set up to disadvantage Black and brown kids, and so part of what I think learning our history is we have to learn how these systems were set up so we can dismantle them, so we can challenge them. And that's why I like understanding history. Right. But I think that's another one of the lessons that I learned from doing the project. And it's not that different, even though 1956 and 57, the technology was different, and women didn't have as many opportunities. There was a whole economic system that was different. It's not that much different than 1956 and 57. Mm-hmm. And again, I want to say that, I have a PhD and I'm very fortunate to be a professor and have opportunities, but I'm not the smartest one. I mean, there's so many other smarter people than me that just didn't get a shot because of the system. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of what I try to do now in my work is to challenge that.
Right, and also to let them know that we're not stupid. We see it.
Exactly.
We know what they're trying to do, and sometimes there's those people that don't see it or just don't want to fight it and just kind of go on with the program.
Exactly.
Do you think a lot of those people that I saw that were like the older Anglo individuals that you interviewed there, a lot of them did kind of recognize and did say, yeah, that stuff was going on back then. Did a lot of them, you think, hold back on what they wanted to say, or did you kind of notice that they kind of held back a little bit on what they noticed, that they might have known a little more than they wanted to, but they just didn't want to talk about it, kind of want to keep it hidden there? Did you notice that at all, like while you were talking to them?
Well, man, when you're an interviewer, you know how that goes. And a lot of them, I mean, first of all, a lot of them didn't want to talk, and then when you introduce a camera, like a video camera, they don't want to talk even more. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is I basically wanted to talk about racism. So I give them credit for talking to me. And I think people, when you watch the film, they're basically saying what we all know, that even though they're not vocalizing it with their body language, with their denials, with their smiles, they're basically acknowledging that they knew that this was going on. But I think it's, for Black, brown, and white people, we're always told, like, don't talk about that. That's not nice. You shouldn't be talking about racism. It's not a nice thing to talk about. It's not good conversation to have. And what I would say is we need to talk about it. And we need to talk about, we're not going to solve our problems. We're not going to help young people achieve what they want to achieve unless we're talking about the messiness. And we're not talking about the uncomfortable situations. There's no grow. You can't grow as a person. You can't grow as a community unless you're dealing with the messy stuff,
Right.
with the uncomfortable stuff. And I think that's what I was trying to do when I was interviewing even the white people in my film. Even though they agreed to do the interview, you're right. They didn't really want to talk about the messiness. My job was to try to get them to talk about the messiness and to be uncomfortable with the situation. And even though it was 60 years ago, they still were uncomfortable with it. Even though they weren't even around, they were still uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. To me, that tells you something, is they knew it was wrong. They knew it was wrong, but they still didn't want to say it. They didn't want to just admit to it. So that's kind of what I think another lesson of the film is, that we have to go towards the discomfort. We have to go towards the messiness. We're not able to solve our issues that we have in our schools, with housing, with jobs, with healthcare, and we're not going to go towards the messiness of it. And, you struggle through that.
I work in the behavioral health department of the county here, and I don't do any of the clinical stuff or anything like that. But when you think about it, when you're a therapist or when you're talking to somebody, unless they break down and let you know their past and everything, unless they let you know, like you said, all the dirty stuff that happened inside them, all the past dirty stuff, you're not going to be able to cure them. You're not going to be able to find out the solution
exactly
without bringing that bad stuff out. And if you keep it buried, it's going to eventually just explode one day.
And I think you're right. It's going to come out at some point. And I think for Latino and Chicano communities, when I see young people who are exploding or who are it's coming out in a negative way, it's going to come out. Like, right. Do you want it to come out in a positive way, or do you want it to come out in a negative way? And so I think learning about who you are, and learning that we come from strong people, and learning that, this all sucks, but look, let's figure out a way to go through this in a positive way, so it doesn't hurt me. That's a better strategy than saying, you know what, don't talk about it. Let's not talk about it. Let's bury it somewhere. Let's deny it. Let's talk like it didn't happen. That's not a solution. And that's what's happened in our schools for so often. Let's not talk about it. Let's not acknowledge that this is who we are and where we come from. And so, and that's what a lot of politicians, Republicans, want us to do now in Texas. They don't want us to talk about it because it's uncomfortable for them. And that's the wrong way to go about it.
We're not like over here saying, hey, let's hate all the white people because of what they did. No way. Let's just kind of understand that we know what happened. Just kind of, say it and let's talk about it, and let's find a way to get it, make it better. We're not asking to bring on a fight or anything like that.
I'm not trying to generalize every white person, but I think the majority, the people that are in power, I think they're worried that we're going to do the same thing that they did to us. And, I think that that's not the case. It's like, hey, man, nobody's trying to put all these white people in one box and say they're all bad. We have white people in our own family. We have people who are allies. We have white people who are colleagues. Mm-hmm. It's more about justice. It's more about what's the right thing here. Right. And that's really the goal of the whole thing.
One of the last males that you interviewed on that film towards the end, he talked about getting paddled with a paddle with holes in it and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And, while you're talking to him, you got emotional. It was pretty sad. I think you even asked him, would you have finished school if it wasn't for all this? And he said, yeah, I would have. Was there a lot of emotional times like that for you doing this project, hearing these stories, because it is so personal to you?
For sure. I think that, again, when I got my PhD in educational leadership and policy, so I study how educational policies impact Latinos and Chicanos and African Americans in the schools. Even though I'm in that, I'm not personally invested. This project was I'm totally in the middle of it because my mom was involved. Right. And a lot of what I was learning about was my own family history. So I was very emotional throughout. And, my mother died in 2002. And like you said, I did the project between 2010 and 13. So even though she had been gone for 7 to 10 years, I was still very much dealing with her death. And so it was emotional to talk to people who knew her. It was emotional to learn, what she went through. It was emotional to learn to interview people who went to high school with her. And so the gentleman you're talking about, Reynaldo Trevino, at the end of the film, he's talking about like he struggled in his life. And if he had had another opportunity, he probably wouldn't have struggled as much. But then he said, you know what? I don't hold a grudge against them. I don't hate them. And so to me, that like really impacted me, right? Because the guy could have been angry. He could have been resentful, but he had a big heart, you know? And so he represents to me a lot of young Chicanas who are struggling today. And so that's why it really impacted me. And it was a very personal project because these people knew my mom. When professors do research, they don't typically get involved with personal projects like that. And the fact that I was interviewing, again, this was a small town. Driscoll is a very small town. These people all knew my mother when she was in elementary school. They knew her in high school. In fact, they voted for her for homecoming queen. They knew her, you know, when she was a young mother. Some of them had even met me when I was a baby, even though I don't remember, obviously. Even though in the film, you watch the interviews, I also talked to them about my mom off camera. And so I was very emotional in the sense that I was still grieving and trying to learn about, you know, her life. And I think in a lot of ways, this coming January, it's going to be 20 years that she died. And I'm still talking about my mom. Yeah. And I'm still, you know, the fact that you and I would have never met. Exactly. But we're having a chance to talk and learn each other's stories and share the story. To me, it's a very powerful thing that in a lot of ways, my mother's still teaching me, even though she's been gone for 20 years, she's still teaching me, you know, how to be a better person and what I want to do, you know, what kind of life do I want to live. And I think a lot of our elders, our abuelitas, abuelitos, tías, tíos, I mean, they teach us that. And sometimes we just have to sit back and acknowledge that they're still teaching us in ways that can help us.
Starting September 1st, they passed a law saying that they don't want there in Texas for this type of stuff to be taught in schools. If it wasn't for my class, I wouldn't have been talking to you like you said right now. What do you think of this whole law that's gonna happen and take effect September 1st? That's preventing people from learning their history. You know, what do you think of that law just being made? Just, you know, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's for those who don't know, like it's part of like what Trump tried to do before he left office, which is ban critical race theory in schools or ban anybody. Basically, don't talk about race, don't talk about racism in schools. You know, so that means you can't teach about slavery. You can't teach about the Civil War. You can't teach about women's rights movement because it's too uncomfortable for the white majority. So they're trying to pass a similar law, or they did pass a similar law in the Texas legislature. And as Albert just mentioned, that means that if a teacher in a public school in Texas wants to show my film, if they want to show my film in their classroom to learn about that time period, they run the chance of getting in trouble and paying a fine and getting sanctioned for doing that. So what it's going to do, it's going to discourage teachers who want to teach the messiness. Teachers who want to teach like, hey, we need to talk about the uncomfortable stuff too. That's how you grow. That's how you question. To me, it doesn't surprise me. Even though I love Texas, the mainly white majority has always wanted to deny who we really are. They've always wanted to silence our side of the history. And that's one of the reasons, you know, people here still talk about the Alamo. Like it's like this is this major part of our history, as if, you know, when the Mexicans beat us at the Alamo, you know, we said, remember the Alamo, that this is part of our Texas history, without understanding that the Texas Revolution was about maintaining slavery. That's what the Texas Revolution was about. It was a slave state, and the Mexican government didn't allow that. So the white settlers wanted to revolt. And so your point and your question, it doesn't surprise me. This is what their playbook is always about this. I think there's a stronger pushback. There's a lot of teachers, there's a lot of young people, there's people at the university level that say, we don't care if you don't want to talk about it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to show films like Stolen Education. We're going to talk about the messiness of the Alamo history that you guys want to whitewash. We're going to talk about the messiness of it. And it's actually good for white students. It's good for white students. It's good for all students to learn about that messiness. And like I said earlier, the white majority who's in power, they're worried because the numbers are not in their favor. They're losing demographically, and this is their last stand. in a lot of ways. Let's get rid of that history in the curriculum. It's just not good for anybody. It's not good for kids. It's not good for teachers. So even though they're doing it, there's still a lot of people who are going to push back against it.
But taking stuff like that away, like if you have if you're teaching a class about African Americans or African Americans in the United States or a Chicano Studies class, taking that away, I mean, what can you really teach then? I mean, just things that are going on today, and it just wouldn't make sense to.
No, you're teaching. You're teaching like first of all, 8 out of the first 10 presidents of the United States, they owned slaves.
Right.
That's a fact.
Yeah.
That is a fact. So you're not supposed to talk about that.
Yeah.
You're just supposed to talk about all the good stuff.
Yeah,
like I'm not saying. Again, it's a fear. That's fear. That's like not wanting to teach truth.
Mm.
That's like, let's just talk about all the good stuff. And I'm not saying, the ideas. I mean, of course, the idea of, freedom and democracy was all good, but let's be real here. Like African Americans, Native Americans were not considered to be human. Women didn't have the right to vote until a long time after that. Right. So you can talk about the idea, but you have to critique it too. Yeah. And you want young people to be able to critique, to be critical thinkers. And so to me, all these moves, all this legislation, all these things that they're trying to do, it's a very desperate and weak move by people who are not going to be in the majority. And so they're worried about that. And but it is what it is. We got to keep pushing forward. I learn a lot. I take a lot from the people, like from the film, like my mother and their family. They didn't have a lot of power, but they still stood up. And there's people like that in California too, and all around the Southwest. And they didn't have money, they didn't have the system, they didn't have anything, but they said, you know what, I'm still going to stand up to you. And so to me, that's what inspires me, is to learn from that time period that, and they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have they organized in different ways. They organized and they resisted in different ways. And to me, that's the biggest takeaway.
If somebody were to ask you, like, what would you advise? Like, let's say that somebody that lived in Texas asked you, they don't want me to watch your film, but what would you advise me to do so your films could be taught in my college or university or whatever it might be? Is there a way to do it, or is it just pretty much, just one of like those dead end streets?
That's a good question. Actually, I was just invited to come talk to the Texas Association of Bilingual Educators group. I'm going to go talk to them in a couple of weeks, and they're probably going to ask me that same thing. Like, we want to teach this kind of work because it's actually good for the students. It's actually going to help them understand, the importance of them, doing well in school, and it's going to help them, strive towards their goals. I tell people, what's the purpose of education? What is your purpose of being an educator? Most people don't do it because they're going to get rich. They do it because it's a calling. They do it because they want to empower young people. They do it because they believe they're basically giving their lives or professional work to the betterment of other people. So if they know that learning about who they are, and if this film's going to help them grow as a person, and it's going to help them understand their place in the world, not just this film, but other, you can't teach about Dolores Huerta. You can't teach about Cesar Chavez. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, these are leaders in our community. You can't teach about the fact that Mexican Americans had the highest number of Congressional Medal of Honor winners in World War II because they were the best fighters. They were put at the front. You can't teach about that. I think that there's going to be teachers who are going to do it anyway. And so I would tell them, don't do it alone. Do it with a group of you. Never work alone. Always work with allies. Always build coalitions. And ask yourself, what is your purpose of being an educator? And I think most people will tell you, like, I'm in it because I want to help other people. I want to empower. Education is empowerment. And so I think we'll be fine. This legislation is just again, it's an indicator of their weakness, an indicator of their fear, and you can't win an argument with fear. You just can't. And I think even though it's a pain in the ass, if you got to deal with it, I think the good guys are going to win on this.
And not just to give you a pat in the back because I have you as a guest here, but I mean, when I think about your film, and just, I'm sure when you think about it, probably when you sit back and think about what you've done, just doing a film on the subject about your mother, and it's blown up to be where it was part of somebody from California, Northern California. Now where I live, I'm originally from Southern California, but it was part of my Chicano Studies class. I mean,
It's
do you
awesome.
ever kind of like think about that and say, man, this film I made, made this much of an impact? Do you ever like really sit back and think about that?
All the time, man. It blows me away. Like I said, when you get your PhD, part of your job is to do research and to write articles and write books and stuff like that. And that's fun and that's part of my job. But this project, this doing this, 1 hour film, um, I've heard from so many different people from all over the country, and to me, and it's been again since 2013. So we're 2021 now.
Mhm.
And I get so much reaction for it, and I'm still getting people who email me. So to me, I feel very proud of it. I feel very proud of my mom and the young students who did that. And to me, they're impacting the way we view the world. They're impacting not only the way we view the world, but what we can do to make it better. I think that group, those 8 children, they were all 7, 8, and 9 years old, 8 of them, in 1957, 1956, 57, when they testified. Even though they didn't know it, they were changing the world in a lot of ways. Because you're right, I wouldn't be talking to you right now, and and then the reach that you have with your podcast, and I went and listened to some of your. I'm real jealous of you, man. You're talking all these boxing grades. I mean, that's awesome. But hopefully, people will listen to your. I know you're trying to talk to other people outside of boxing.
Mhm.
Um, it has a wider reach, and so the good thing is that story doesn't die. Those stories don't die, and people learn from it. And so to me, that's the biggest joy of my life is that at this point in my professional career is that people have watched it. And again, I've been very fortunate. I have friends in different universities. They've invited me. So I mean, I've showed the film like North Dakota. I've showed it in South Carolina, of course, all over California. And now that it's on Amazon Prime, people can watch it on Amazon Prime, and they can watch it with their family. So I think my mother's story and her friends, the people who did it, they're still teaching people about that part of our history.
And they need to, and it can't be forgotten, and it can't just be buried there. And it's a very important part of history, Chicano history, just all around history,
Exactly.
Texas history.
And I tell people this all the time too. Like, you'd be surprised how much of these stories you have in your own family.
Yeah.
So if anybody listens to this, I would say go talk to don't be like me, and don't wait till it's too late. Go talk to your family members. Ask them what it was like growing up when they grew up. If you're if you're first or second generation, ask them what it was like to come here. Why did they come here? And sometimes people aren't ready to talk about it. I think that's another reason my mother didn't tell me. She wasn't ready to talk about it, and then she died, and it was too late. But sometimes when they get a little bit older, they're ready to talk about it, but they're never given the opportunity to talk about it. So I would tell people, the stories in your family, I guarantee you, are amazing. I guarantee you they're amazing. And it just takes the time. Now everybody's got a phone. Have a cup of coffee with your grandmother, right? And do an oral history with her.
Yeah.
You'll be surprised the amount of power and struggle and inspiration that you have in your own family, and it's literally sitting in your own house.
Yeah.
But if you don't take the time to do it, don't wait till it's too late. I'm telling you, do not wait.
You went to school, you got your doctorate, you're fully educated. Tell us a little bit about what else you do there.
So I graduated from the University of Texas in Austin with a PhD, and got a job at the University of Utah. So I teach classes for people who want to become master's classes and doctoral classes who want to become administrators. So a principal, school district superintendent, people who work at universities, administrators. So those are the kinds of classes that I teach. And so I did that for 11 years at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And I never thought I would move to Salt Lake City, but they gave me a job. And, I thought, I'll be there for 5 years and I'll move back home because both my wife and I are from Texas. But we ended up staying there for 11. She graduated with her PhD, my wife, and was able to get a job there. So we stuck around for a little bit longer. And in 2015, we moved back. We both got jobs at the University of Texas in San Antonio. She teaches classes in Mexican American Studies, and I was in education. And then last year, I moved to Trinity University, also in San Antonio, so we didn't have to move. It's a private school, smaller school, and my wife stayed at UTSA. So, yeah, I'm about to start my 18th year as a professor and a researcher, and just continue to do research that hopefully will change for the better schools for our people, for our gente, and then training and preparing the next generation of principals and administrators who want to go into our schools and in our communities and hopefully work for the better in our schools. So that's kind of what I do. My parents didn't go to college, so for me, I just wanted to go to college. Whatever college that was, I was very lucky to get into a school here in San Antonio called St. Mary's University, a small Catholic school, and graduated. Was very happy about that. But then I had the opportunity to get a master's degree at Columbia University in New York City. So I took it. And then even after that, I got a job and I had the opportunity to go to get my doctorate, and I just took it and got the doctorate. So that's kind of how, for me, as a first generation, first in my family to go to college, I always had mentors along the way, and my parents were always super supportive. They said, go for it. And I always just wanted to help, do research and do work that's going to help our community. And so that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 18 years.
And my friend, I'm sure your mom would be very proud of you. And, I don't need to know her to know that, everything you've accomplished, everything you've,
I appreciate it, brother. Appreciate it.
Getting the job done and telling her story. I'm sure she'd be very proud of you. And my friend, thank you very much for coming on to TheBoxingBar.com.